The night is silent, heavy with the kind of stillness that makes every whisper feel like thunder. In a dimly lit room within the royal residence, a man who has carried the weight of a crown and the burden of secrets lies frail, his breathing shallow. King Charles, the monarch who ascended the throne late in life after decades of waiting, now finds himself face to face with mortality. His voice, cracked with age and weakened by illness, carries words that are destined to send shockwaves across the world. I know what happened in Paris, and it wasn't just an accident. In that single moment, the entire foundation of what millions believed about one of the most tragic nights in modern history threatens to collapse. It is not only a confession, but a revelation that reopens old wounds, rekindles forgotten suspicions, and forces the world to confront a possibility that has always lingered in the shadows. From the moment Princess Diana's life was cut short in a Paris tunnel on August 31st, 1997, the story of her death has been shrouded in questions. The official line has always been that it was a terrible accident, caused by a reckless driver, paparazzi chasing her car, and an unfortunate twist of fate. But for nearly 3 decades, whispers have persisted. Whispers of foul play, of powerful forces unwilling to see Diana live the life she had begun to carve out for herself beyond the monarchy. Whispers that her relationship with Dodi Fayed represented more than romance. It symbolized independence that threatened the very fabric of royal image-making. Now, decades later, Charles's words reignite every suspicion, and suspicion becomes something far darker when it comes from the lips of a dying king. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But why now? Why would Charles, a man so accustomed to silence, protocol, and discretion, choose his final breaths to lift the veil on a story so explosive? Perhaps it is guilt, a conscience that has grown heavier with each year since Diana's death. Perhaps it is the knowledge that the truth, however murky, cannot remain buried forever. Or perhaps, in his own way, he is seeking redemption, one last attempt to free himself from a prison of silence that has suffocated him for 44 long years. For the first time, we are forced to consider not only what Charles knew, but what he endured by keeping that knowledge hidden. The confession is not merely about one tragic night in Paris. It touches on decades of royal history, rivalries, betrayals, and a web of relationships that define not only Diana's life, but Charles's own. To understand the gravity of his dying words, one must return to the turbulent years of their marriage, the cracks that widened into public scandal, and the relentless pressure that followed Diana even after her divorce. Charles's words hint at forces larger than personal jealousy, larger even than royal family drama. They point toward a machinery of power, image, and influence that may have seen Diana not as a cherished princess, but as a problem to be solved. The beginning of this story, however, is not in Paris but years earlier, when Diana first captured the world's heart. Her beauty, her compassion, and her ability to connect with ordinary people made her more than just a royal bride. She became the people's princess. And that popularity came with consequences. While Charles often felt overshadowed by her presence, others within the establishment worried about her unpredictability. Diana spoke openly about her struggles, her fears, and the suffocating reality of palace life. She was not content to play the role quietly. She wanted her own voice, her own story, and her own love. And therein lay the danger. When Diana entered a relationship with Dodi Fayed, the son of billionaire Mohammed Al Fayed, it represented more than romance. To some, it was scandalous, a princess who might marry outside the circles of the British aristocracy, and worse, a man of Egyptian and Muslim background. This was not simply about personal happiness. It was about what it symbolized for the monarchy's image and the establishment's sense of control. For Charles to now hint that Diana's death was not entirely accidental is to confirm that those fears and suspicions may have had deadly consequences. His words pierce through years of official statements, endless inquests, and public mourning. They force us to re-examine everything we thought we knew. The middle of this introduction must hold the weight of that possibility. Imagine the fear Diana herself carried. In letters revealed after her death, she wrote of her worries, stating chillingly that there were plans to tamper with her car. She was a woman aware of the forces around her, aware that her choices carried consequences beyond her control. For years, conspiracy theories were dismissed as baseless speculation, the domain of tabloids and sensationalists. Yet now, when Charles himself implies something darker, those theories gain a legitimacy that cannot be ignored. Consider the impact of his words not just on history, but on the present. What does this mean for William and Harry, Diana's sons, who have carried the burden of her loss in different ways? Harry has spoken often of never finding closure, of living with questions that gnawed at his soul. William, more reserved, has shouldered the responsibility of monarchy while burying his pain under duty. If their father's dying confession aligns with the suspicions Diana herself harbored, then the entire narrative of their mother's death changes forever. This is no longer just grief. It is betrayal by a system meant to protect her. The end of this introduction leaves us standing on the precipice of truth and uncertainty. Charles's confession is not a neat resolution. It is a key that opens a door to shadows deeper than most dare to imagine. Was Diana's death orchestrated to preserve the monarchy's image? Were powerful figures so threatened by her independence that they saw no other solution? Or is Charles, in his final hours, unburdening himself of guilt that may or may not match reality? As we move into the heart of this story, we will retrace the night in Paris, explore Diana's final days, examine the forces surrounding her, and uncover the meaning behind Charles's 44-year silence. His words do not settle the story, they ignite it. They invite us to question, to reflect, and to confront the uncomfortable idea that what happened in Paris may never have been a simple accident. The People's Princess may have been more dangerous to the establishment alive than dead, and now, in his last breaths, the king himself has implied that truth. This is not just a story of one woman's tragic end. It is the story of power, secrecy, and the price of silence. And as Charles's voice fades, the world is left with the echo of a confession that demands to be heard, demands to be understood, and demands that we ask once more, what really happened in Paris that night? The room where the king now lies is a stark reminder of how fragile even the most powerful of lives can be. The grandeur of royalty cannot mask the frailty of a body weighed down by age, illness, and decades of unspoken truths. Charles's breath rattles in his chest, and yet his words carry more force than any decree he ever signed as monarch. It is not ceremony or protocol that defines this moment. It is confession, a confession that refuses to die with him. Those in the room feel the gravity instantly. What they hear is not just a fading man's rambling, but the kind of statement that could topple reputations, reopen investigations, and shake the monarchy itself to its foundations. The king's final truth is aimed not at protecting the crown, but at lifting the veil that has suffocated it for generations. To understand why this moment is so heavy, one must recall the image of Diana that lingers in the world's collective memory. She was the fairy tale princess who turned into a global icon, adored by the people but tormented behind palace walls. Her life was a constant struggle between duty and desire, between public adoration and private despair. In Charles's dying words, the entire saga of her tragedy collapses into a single point of focus: Paris. And in naming Paris, he doesn't just recall the city where she died. He invokes the night that changed everything. It was a night that seemed at first like a series of unfortunate coincidences. A Mercedes, speeding through the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, pursued by paparazzi desperate for one more photograph of the world's most photographed woman. A driver, later found to have been under the influence of alcohol. A crash that silenced a life too luminous to be contained. That was the narrative given to the world. Yet almost immediately, the doubts began. Too many strange details. Too many unanswered questions. Diana's own ominous premonitions, written in her own hand, warning that her car might one day be tampered with. The rapidity with which the official story was sealed. For decades, suspicion remained. But suspicion without proof is a ghost people learn to live with. Now, with Charles's admission, the ghost takes on flesh. For 44 years, he held a secret so immense it gnawed at him even as he carried out his royal duties. The secret is not just about what happened in Paris, but about why it happened. What was so threatening about Diana's choices that her life had to end so abruptly? Why did the establishment treat her as both an asset and a liability? Why did Charles, the man who once shared vows with her, stay silent all these years until his deathbed forced the truth from his lips? The answer lies in the storm of contradictions that defined Diana's life after leaving the palace. She was no longer bound by the rigid constraints of her marriage. She was divorced, free to live as she chose, and her romance with Dodi Fayed symbolized that newfound independence. To the world, it was love. To some inside the walls of power, it was rebellion. The idea of Diana marrying Dodi was not simply personal, it was political. A princess of Wales, mother to a future king, uniting herself with a man whose background challenged the establishment's sense of tradition, status, and perhaps prejudice. If Charles's dying words are true, then Diana's fate was not sealed by chance, but by fear. Fear of what she represented if she were allowed to live freely. The middle of this confession is not just about Diana's love life. It is about the culture of secrecy that has always cloaked the monarchy. For centuries, the crown has thrived on the ability to control narratives, to present the world with the version of events it wanted remembered. Scandals were covered up, enemies silenced, and the public fed carefully crafted images. But Diana broke that pattern. She was too open, too candid, too willing to expose her pain. She gave interviews that rattled the palace. She admitted to affairs, to suffering, to feeling isolated. She spoke not like a royal, but like a human being. And in doing so, she pierced the mystique that had shielded the monarchy for generations. That, perhaps more than anything, was her crime in the eyes of the establishment. Charles, by keeping this truth buried, became part of the silence that preserved the institution. But a silence this heavy cannot last forever. As he reaches his final moments, the silence erupts into words. It is as though the weight of history demands release. He can no longer bear the knowledge that the woman he once loved, the mother of his sons, may have been more victim than casualty. He admits what millions have suspected, but what no one in his position had ever dared to say. It was not just an accident. The end of this introduction does not grant closure. In fact, it tears open wounds that had begun to scar. The questions multiply instead of resolving. Was Charles himself complicit in keeping Diana vulnerable? Was he powerless to stop forces greater than himself? Or was his silence a reluctant pact with those who demanded he protect the crown at all costs? We may never know the full truth, but the power of his confession lies not in its clarity, but in its disruption. The story of Diana's death is no longer just about Paris, a tunnel, and a crash. It is about betrayal, manipulation, and the price of freedom in a world where image is more valuable than life itself. As viewers, we are left unsettled. What really happened in Paris? Was the people's princess silenced because she dared to live on her own terms? And if the king himself could not carry this truth to his grave, what does that mean for the monarchy that survives him? This story, now reignited, is not merely history. It is alive, and it demands to be told. The chamber where King Charles lay was thick with a sense of inevitability. Curtains were drawn tight, shutting out the world, and the air felt heavy as though the walls themselves knew that history was about to be made. At his bedside were only a few trusted faces, people who had weathered both triumphs and scandals by his side. They were used to silence, to duty, to never repeating what was spoken behind palace walls. But tonight was different. Tonight, Charles's frail voice carried a weight that pierced through decades of royal secrecy. His words were not for ceremony, not for speeches polished by advisors, but for the raw truth that he had carried deep in his chest. And when he finally spoke them, they were not rehearsed, not softened, they were haunting. "I know what happened in Paris," he said, his breath shallow. And it wasn't just an accident. The silence after his words was deafening. Every person in the room froze, their eyes searching one another for confirmation that they had heard what they thought they had. A king, on his deathbed, had just broken one of the monarchy's most guarded silences. For years, suspicions about Diana's death had swirled around the world, whispered in conversations, debated in documentaries, written in columns. But never had such an admission come from within the family itself, and certainly not from the man who was once her husband. In that single moment, Charles transformed speculation into confession. His voice was weak, but the impact of his words thundered louder than anything else that had been said about Diana since 1997. The bedside scene is not merely about a frail king. It is about the collision of history, guilt, and consequence. Charles had lived for decades with the knowledge of Diana's fate, watching as official reports declared it an accident, while private whispers suggested something far darker. Perhaps he himself had not been part of the orchestration, but he knew enough to recognize that powerful forces did not want Diana free, did not want her building a new life outside the palace, and certainly not by the side of Dodi Fayed. For 44 years, he carried that silence, bound by duty and fear. Yet at the end, when life's final breath was closer than tomorrow's sunrise, he chose to speak. Why would a man who built his life around restraint and control finally allow such a truth to escape? It is not unusual for the dying to unburden themselves, to confess sins or secrets that have eaten away at their spirit. For Charles, the memory of Diana's death was not simply a private loss. It was a global tragedy that he had been tied to for decades. He had endured the world's suspicion, the public's anger, and his own guilt, knowing the woman who had once been his wife had died in circumstances that were not as simple as newspapers declared. This moment at his bedside was more than confession, it was release. Release from the silence that had bound him tighter than the crown ever had. The atmosphere in the room was one of shock. Aides had expected perhaps parting words about duty, about family, or about the future of the monarchy under William. Instead, they heard the kind of statement that could ripple through history books. The weight of it was not lost on anyone. If Charles's words were ever repeated, the monarchy would not be remembered solely for its traditions, but for its secrets. Yet how could words like these remain locked behind closed doors? Once spoken, they carry a life of their own, demanding to be acknowledged. Charles's confession also paints him not as a man in control, but as one haunted by forces greater than himself. Throughout his life, he was seen as both a figure of privilege and a prisoner of duty. His relationship with Diana had been marked by love, betrayal, and bitterness. He had chosen Camilla, and the world had never forgiven him for it fully. But in this moment of confession, Charles revealed a deeper truth, that even he, the heir who became king, was powerless to stop what had happened to Diana. He had known, he had carried the knowledge, and he had remained silent. His silence may have preserved the monarchy, but it came at the cost of his peace. Now, on his deathbed, that silence cracked open. The bedside confession is not merely about Diana. It is about the very nature of power and how it corrupts truth. Charles's words suggest that the monarchy is not simply a family or an institution, but a fortress built on control. The truth of Diana's death had been sealed away not to protect her memory, but to protect the structure of the crown. A woman who had been adored by millions, who had outshined the very family she married into, could not be allowed to alter the course of history through marriage to Dodi Fayed. And so, whether through deliberate orchestration or willful negligence, forces ensured that her journey ended in Paris. Charles, knowing this, chose silence. Until now. There is a striking humanity in this scene. A man so often portrayed as distant, aloof, and rigid suddenly stripped bare of pretense. His words were not polished or careful, they were desperate, raw, and trembling with regret. It is the kind of confession that cannot be rehearsed. It is the cry of someone who has lived too long with guilt and too little with peace. Those who heard it in that chamber would never forget it. They might argue later about what he meant, about how much he knew, about whether he was speaking literally or metaphorically. But they would never escape the fact that the king himself had cast doubt on the story of Diana's death. The power of this moment lies not only in the words themselves, but in their timing. A living king might have been too bound by obligation to speak. A younger man might have been too afraid of consequences. But a dying man has little left to lose. Charles's confession came at the threshold between life and death, where truth is often laid bare. And because of that, it cannot be dismissed as easily as rumor or speculation. It is testimony, delivered in the only way a man of his position could ever offer it. At the end, what happens after such a confession? Those who were present must now grapple with the responsibility of his words. Do they remain silent, preserving the monarchy's image, or do they risk history's wrath by repeating what they heard? The world has long debated the truth of Diana's death, but never before has a monarch himself given voice to the doubts. With Charles's dying breath, the official narrative fractures, and through those cracks floods a torrent of questions that can no longer be ignored. The bedside confession is the spark that reignites an old fire. It forces us to confront what Diana meant to the world and why her death continues to haunt us. Was she silenced because she was too powerful in her humanity? Was her love for Dodi Fayed a threat to the image of the monarchy? And most haunting of all, did Charles know all along that the truth of her death was something far darker than an accident? This is where the story begins, not in Paris but in the quiet of a royal chamber, where a frail king's whisper carries more weight than the roar of nations. It is the moment where history bends, where silence breaks, and where the truth that has been buried for decades finally claws its way to the surface. The night that Diana lost her life is etched into history not just because of the tragedy itself, but because of the mysteries that have always clung to it. To understand the weight of King Charles's dying admission, we must walk back into that fateful night in Paris, a night that began with glamour and expectation but ended in horror and silence. The story of Diana's last hours has been told countless times, yet every retelling leaves behind shadows. The official version offers a simple narrative: a car, a chase, a crash. But the truth is layered, and the details, when placed side by side, reveal a picture far more unsettling than an ordinary accident. It began on August 30th, 1997. Diana was in Paris with Dodi Fayed, her companion, and perhaps, according to whispers, soon-to-be fiancé. They had dined at the Ritz Hotel, owned by Dodi's father, Mohammed Al Fayed. Security was tight, but the press had followed them relentlessly throughout their time together. The paparazzi were everywhere, waiting for a glimpse of the most famous woman in the world. To Diana, this was nothing new. She had lived for years under their lenses, her every move recorded, her private life dissected. But this night carried a different intensity. Dodi had purchased a ring earlier that day, fueling speculation that an engagement was imminent. For Diana, it was a night where she felt on the brink of a new chapter, but for others, perhaps it was a night that threatened to upend the established order. Shortly before midnight, the couple decided to leave the Ritz. Their plan was to return to Dodi's Paris apartment. To evade the swarm of photographers outside, a decoy car was prepared at the front entrance, while Diana and Dodi were ushered out the back to a waiting Mercedes S280 driven by Henri Paul, the Ritz's deputy head of security. Alongside them sat Trevor Rees-Jones, a bodyguard. As the car pulled away, it was quickly tailed by paparazzi on motorbikes. What followed was a chase through the Parisian streets that grew more frantic with every passing second. At 12:23 a.m. on August 31st, the Mercedes entered the Pont de l'Alma tunnel at high speed. Moments later, it crashed into the 13th pillar. The scene was chaos. Henri Paul and Dodi Fayed were killed instantly. Diana, gravely injured, was still alive, her body crumpled but clinging to breath. Trevor Rees-Jones survived with severe injuries. Eyewitnesses described the sounds, the screech of metal, the sudden stillness after impact. The world's most beloved princess lay dying in the wreckage, unseen by the millions who adored her, but witnessed by those who rushed to her side. Emergency services arrived swiftly, but the timeline of what followed has always raised questions. Diana was removed from the wreckage and transported to the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital. Reports state that she went into cardiac arrest en route. Doctors fought to save her, but at 4 a.m., her death was announced. The world awoke to the news with disbelief. The woman who had survived scandals, heartbreak, and relentless media attention was gone, taken in an instant. But almost immediately, suspicion bloomed. Why was Henri Paul behind the wheel? And why was he later found to have alcohol in his system when he had not appeared intoxicated earlier in the evening? Why was the car traveling at such high speed through a tunnel rather than taking a safer route? Why was the scene of the crash not treated as a potential crime scene? These questions were not raised only by conspiracy theorists, but by ordinary people who struggled to reconcile the inconsistencies. Charles's words, decades later, now add fuel to that unease. His statement that it was not just an accident echoes what so many had long felt, but were powerless to prove. The middle of this chapter lies in the contradictions. Paparazzi were blamed immediately, yet their photographs provided evidence that emergency services lingered longer at the scene before moving Diana. Critics argued that in other countries, she might have been rushed directly to a hospital with greater urgency. Then there was the car itself. a Mercedes that had once been stolen and later returned, with questions lingering about whether it had been properly maintained. Mohammed Al-Fayed would go on to claim that his son and Diana were assassinated, victims of a plot by the establishment to prevent their marriage. He insisted that the crash was not chance but design, that forces within the British establishment could not accept the idea of the future king's mother marrying a Muslim man. For years, official inquiries tried to quell these suspicions. The French investigation concluded it was an accident caused by Henri Paul's reckless driving. The British Operation Paget report in 2006 reached the same conclusion. Yet even within those reports, inconsistencies surfaced. Witnesses described seeing bright flashes in the tunnel just before the crash. Others claimed the Mercedes was being closely followed by vehicles that vanished after the collision. And then, of course, there were Diana's own letters. Letters in which she had written of her fear that she would be killed in a staged accident. To many, these notes read like prophecy. The final hours of Diana's life remain a haunting puzzle because of how much they symbolized. She was a woman on the cusp of a new beginning, yet she was also a woman still tethered to her role as the mother of two princes. Had she married Dodi, the stepfather of the future king would have been a man whose background challenged the monarchy's image. For some, this was inconceivable. And so, the questions persist. Was her death a tragedy of circumstance, or was it the deliberate silencing of a woman who had become too powerful, too unpredictable, too free? The end of this chapter must settle not on answers, but on the heavy weight of Charles's words against this backdrop. Every detail of that night, from the driver to the route to the delay in medical treatment, takes on new meaning when filtered through his confession. If it was not an accident, then it was something orchestrated, and the people behind it were not strangers in the night, but figures tied to the most powerful circles in the world. This forces us to ask, what exactly did Charles know, and what role did he play in keeping that knowledge hidden? Was his bedside confession an admission of complicity, or was it the cry of a man who knew too much and said too little for too long? Diana's last hours in Paris remain frozen in time, but with Charles's revelation, they are no longer simply history. They are evidence. Evidence of a larger story that has yet to be fully uncovered. And as we leave this chapter, the haunting truth is clear. The princess who lived her life under constant surveillance may have died not because of chance, but because of choice. A choice made by forces too powerful to be named, until a dying king finally broke the silence. The story of Diana's relationship with Dodi Fayed is more than a romantic subplot in the life of the people's princess. It was, in many ways, the final act of defiance in a life that had been defined by battles against control. To understand why Charles's confession holds such gravity, one must examine the bond between Diana and Dodi and the wider implications it carried. It was not merely a love story. It was a statement. It was a choice that sent ripples of unease through the corridors of power, both in Buckingham Palace and beyond. And it may have been the very catalyst that set in motion the tragedy in Paris. Dodi Fayed was not an unknown figure. The son of Mohammed Al-Fayed, the billionaire owner of Harrods, Dodi came from immense wealth and influence. He was well-connected, charismatic, and had lived a life accustomed to luxury. Yet he also carried with him the weight of being an outsider in the eyes of the British establishment. His Egyptian heritage and his father's outspoken criticism of the royal family made him a controversial companion for Diana. But for Diana, who had long felt suffocated by rigid tradition and endless judgment, Dodi offered freedom. He was not tied to the palace, not bound by the monarchy's rules, and not interested in controlling her voice. With him, she could laugh, relax, and perhaps, for the first time in years, imagine a future built on her own terms. Their relationship blossomed in the summer of 1997. Photographs of Diana and Dodi aboard a yacht in the Mediterranean splashed across tabloids worldwide. She looked radiant, smiling in ways that many had not seen since before the breakdown of her marriage to Charles. To the public, these images suggested happiness. To the monarchy, however, they signaled potential crisis. A divorced princess of Wales, the mother of the heirs to the throne, in a public romance with the son of a man who was often painted as an enemy of the establishment, it was a narrative the palace could not control. Behind the scenes, speculation swirled that Dodi planned to propose to Diana. Reports emerged that he had purchased an engagement ring from a jeweler in Paris just days before the fatal crash. Mohammed Al Fayed himself would later insist that Diana and Dodi intended to marry, that they were in love, and that their union posed a direct threat to those who wished to preserve the monarchy's carefully curated image. For the royal family, such a marriage would not merely have been socially awkward, it would have been politically explosive. The idea of a Muslim man as a stepfather to the future King of England was unthinkable to many within the British establishment. The middle of this story lies in the tension between personal freedom and institutional preservation. Diana's life had always been defined by that conflict. As a young bride, she was expected to mold herself to the needs of the monarchy, to be a silent support to Charles, to smile and wave while hiding her despair. But as she grew older, Diana refused to play the part quietly. She spoke openly about her struggles with mental health, her bulimia, her loneliness. She revealed the truth about her marriage in the now iconic Panorama interview, famously declaring that there were 3 of us in this marriage. Each act of defiance chipped away at the monarchy's image, but it also endeared her further to the public. By the time she entered into her relationship with Dodi, Diana was no longer just a royal. She was a symbol of independence. To those who admired her, Diana's romance with Dodi was the final step in her journey toward freedom. To those who feared her, it was dangerous. What if Diana married Dodi and had more children? What if her influence, already immense, extended beyond Britain and into circles that clashed with the establishment's interests? What if her voice, already uncontrollable, became even louder as she stood outside the monarchy's shadow with the protection of a billionaire family behind her? These questions were not merely idle speculation. They were the very fears that Charles's bedside confession seems to confirm, that Diana's death was not an accident, but the result of forces who could not allow that future to unfold. Even the smallest details of their relationship carried symbolic weight. Their public appearances, often affectionate, contrasted starkly with the rigid, distant displays the world had grown used to from the royal family. The photographs of Diana kissing Dodi became global headlines not just because they were romantic, but because they represented liberation. For a woman who had once been trapped in loveless duty, those moments with Dodi were proof that she could still choose joy. But joy, in this case, was interpreted by others as rebellion. The end of this chapter lies in the heavy realization of what Diana and Dodi's bond truly represented. It was not just 2 people in love. It was a union that threatened to rewrite the royal family's narrative. It was a challenge to centuries of tradition, to unspoken prejudices, and to the carefully guarded boundaries of the monarchy. For Diana, it may have been a chance at happiness. For others, it was a risk too great to allow. When Charles whispered that Diana's death was not just an accident, he was not simply echoing the suspicions of conspiracy theorists. He was acknowledging what those inside the monarchy had long feared, that her relationship with Dodi made her a target. It was not the paparazzi's flashbulbs that were the real danger. It was the idea of Diana living free, beloved, and untethered, with Dodi Fayed at her side. That image, more than anything, may have sealed her fate. And so, the Fayed connection becomes central to this story. It was love, yes, but it was also power. It was personal choice colliding with institutional control. It was the kind of union that could have changed the monarchy forever. And for that, Diana and Dodi may have paid the ultimate price. When Charles whispered on his deathbed that what happened in Paris was not just an accident, his words pointed directly towards something that has always lingered in the background of Diana's story: the presence of powerful forces that extended beyond her personal life. This chapter is not about romance or family conflict alone. It is about the networks of influence, loyalty, and fear that surrounded the monarchy. To understand Diana's fate, one must examine the systems that had the means and the motive to shape events. The monarchy itself has always been more than one family. It is a fortress backed by government, intelligence, tradition, and those who believe that the survival of the crown is more important than the survival of any individual. Power in Britain is not always visible. It is not confined to Buckingham Palace, nor to Downing Street, nor even to Parliament. It moves quietly through corridors where decisions are made with subtlety, where outcomes are influenced without fingerprints. Diana, by the final years of her life, was not simply a woman divorced from the heir to the throne. She was a global figure with influence that rivaled the monarchy itself. Crowds adored her. The media hung on her every word, and her humanitarian work gave her a platform larger than that of any royal at the time. To some, this was inspiring. To others, it was threatening. A divorced princess who remained more beloved than the future king's own son was an anomaly the monarchy was not prepared to tolerate. The notion of powerful forces at play begins with the establishment's fear of scandal. Diana's willingness to speak openly about her struggles and her unhappiness within the royal marriage broke the golden rule of the monarchy: never explain, never complain. Her Panorama interview was more than a revelation about her marriage. It was a direct challenge to the image of the crown. In that interview, she exposed not only her personal suffering but the dysfunction of the very institution she was once meant to uphold. Such boldness won her sympathy from the public but earned her lasting enmity within the establishment. In a world where perception is survival, Diana had become unpredictable. Then came her romance with Dodi Fayed. The prospect of a princess marrying the son of Mohammed al-Fayed was viewed by many in positions of power as unthinkable. Mohammed had long been critical of the royal family and the British establishment, accusing them of elitism and racism. For the monarchy, already facing scrutiny and declining approval after Charles and Diana's divorce, the idea of Mohammed's family being tied to the royal line was intolerable. And so the whispers began. Could the establishment, threatened by this potential union, have allowed or even orchestrated Diana's demise? Charles's words on his deathbed seemed to point toward that possibility. It is also impossible to ignore the role of intelligence networks. Stories have circulated for decades suggesting that Diana was under surveillance in the months leading up to her death. Claims that her phone was tapped, that her movements were monitored, that she was watched not just by paparazzi, but by agencies tasked with national security. The justification, at least publicly, would have been her global prominence and her associations, which extended beyond royalty into politics and philanthropy. Yet beneath that justification lies a darker implication, that her every step was known, and if her final journey through Paris was as suspicious as Charles implied, then it was likely not a surprise to those who were watching. The middle of this chapter must confront the question of motive. What exactly made Diana so dangerous that her continued existence posed a threat? It was not her humanitarian work, though her landmine campaign certainly made enemies in the arms industry. It was not her beauty or her celebrity, though these made her the most recognizable woman in the world. The danger was in what she symbolized: independence. She had stepped outside the control of the monarchy and the establishment, and she had shown that she could not be silenced. Her willingness to speak, her choice to live freely, her refusal to obey unspoken rules. These were the qualities that made her beloved by the people and feared by those who relied on silence to maintain power. In this context, Charles's confession takes on chilling clarity. He had lived long enough to know how decisions were made behind closed doors, how appearances were carefully curated, how scandals were buried before they reached the light. He understood better than anyone that Diana's freedom was seen as dangerous. And so when he whispered that what happened in Paris was not simply an accident, he was not speaking as a grieving husband, but as a man who had seen the inner workings of power. He knew that the story of Diana's death was not only about a car and a tunnel. It was about the forces that had decided she could not be allowed to live the life she was building. The end of this chapter rests in the uncomfortable truth that the monarchy is never only a family. It is an institution backed by centuries of preservation at any cost. When Diana broke free, when she dared to live outside its control, she became more than a former princess. She became a symbol that threatened to eclipse the crown itself. In that world, where image and survival matter more than humanity, decisions are made not by individuals, but by systems. And those systems have the power to silence. As we step away from this chapter, we are left with the haunting realization that Diana may not have died because of bad luck or reckless driving. She may have died because powerful forces decided her future posed too great a risk. And Charles, who lived his life entangled in those same forces, carried that truth for 44 years until his final breaths tore it into the open. For 44 years, Charles carried a secret that weighed on him heavier than the crown itself. The monarchy has always thrived on silence, on discretion, on protecting the image of the institution at all costs. But Charles's life was uniquely entangled with a truth he could never speak. To the public, he was a man who endured scandal, endured years of waiting, endured the criticism of being overshadowed by Diana. To those close to him, he was also a man burdened by knowledge, the kind of knowledge that could not be shared in speeches, could not be confessed in interviews, and could not be written in memoirs. His secret was tied to the most painful event in modern royal history, the death of Diana, Princess of Wales. The idea of a 44-year silence seems staggering, but when one examines Charles's life, it becomes clear how such a secret could be buried for so long. He was trained from childhood to control emotion, to suppress personal truth for the sake of duty. His every move was monitored, his every word weighed for consequence. When Diana died, Charles was thrust into a paradox. He was both the grieving ex-husband of the woman who had captured the world's heart and the heir to a monarchy that could not afford its image to collapse under suspicion. To admit even the smallest doubt about the nature of Diana's death would have been to fan flames that could burn the institution itself. And so he chose silence. But silence is not the absence of truth. Silence is its own prison. For decades, Charles lived with the memory of Diana's death not only as a personal loss, but as a knowledge that her end was not as simple as the official record claimed. It was in Paris that her life ended, but the forces that led her there had been moving long before. He understood this, and he understood why those forces could never be named. He watched as the public built its own theories, as Mohammed al-Fayed accused the monarchy of murder, as newspapers speculated endlessly. He heard it all, and he knew, but he never spoke. His silence became a pact, one he could not break without jeopardizing everything he was sworn to uphold. The secret, however, was not only about Diana. It was about himself. For years, Charles was cast as the villain in the story of his marriage. His affair with Camilla, his coldness toward Diana, his inability to connect with her the way the public had, these became part of his reputation. In many ways, Diana's death cemented that narrative. The world mourned her and blamed him, consciously or unconsciously, for her pain. What few realized was that Charles was also trapped by forces larger than himself. His role as heir meant that he could not defy the machinery that surrounded him, could not expose the truths he knew. The very system that had made him a king had also made him complicit in silence. The middle of this chapter is found in the toll such silence takes. Imagine carrying knowledge for 44 years that the woman you once loved, the mother of your children, may have been silenced not by fate, but by design. Imagine attending ceremonies, speaking at public events, raising your sons, all while knowing the official story was only part of the truth. Imagine watching your sons grieve, watching them struggle with unanswered questions, and never being able to tell them what you knew. This was Charles's life. His silence was not simply about protecting the crown. It was about shielding his sons from a truth too heavy to bear. Yet in shielding them, he condemned himself to a life of unspoken guilt. The 44-year secret was also about timing. In the years following Diana's death, the monarchy faced crises of credibility. Public opinion was fragile. Charles himself was deeply unpopular, his relationship with Camilla seen as an insult to Diana's memory. Any revelation hinting at foul play in Diana's death would have been catastrophic, not only for the monarchy, but for Charles personally. He could not risk it. He could not risk the monarchy collapsing before he even ascended the throne. And so he carried the secret, year after year, until age and illness finally stripped him of the ability to keep it inside. When he finally whispered the words, "I know what happened in Paris, and it wasn't just an accident," he was not only speaking of Diana's death. He was speaking of his own imprisonment in silence. He was confessing not just what he knew, but what he had endured by keeping it hidden. His secret had defined his reign before it began. It shaped how he was seen, how he lived, and how he bore the weight of history. In breaking that silence on his deathbed, he was not just revealing a truth, he was freeing himself. The end of this chapter leaves us with the chilling realization that secrets, no matter how deeply buried, do not stay hidden forever. Charles's 44-year silence shows us how power can suppress truth, but it also shows us that truth has a way of clawing its way back to the surface. His confession is not a neat resolution. It is a fracture in the story we thought we knew. It is the reminder that history is often shaped not by what is said, but by what is left unsaid. And when the silence finally breaks, the echo is louder than any lie. When people first heard about the crash in Paris, it was reported with the immediacy of breaking news. A terrible accident, they said. The paparazzi chased Diana's car, the driver lost control, and tragedy struck. That was the version fed to the world, and for many, it became the accepted truth. Yet beneath the surface of that narrative lay details that never quite fit. The longer investigators looked, the more inconsistencies emerged. And when King Charles whispered with his last breaths that it had not been just an accident, those inconsistencies suddenly became threads pointing towards something darker, a cover-up designed to shield the truth and protect powerful interests. The first suspicious detail was the treatment of the crash site itself. Normally, in cases of sudden and high-profile deaths, a crash site would be secured immediately as a potential crime scene. In Paris, that did not happen. Within hours, the tunnel where Diana's car collided with the 13th pillar was reopened to traffic. Blood was washed away, debris cleared, and any chance of a meticulous forensic investigation vanished. Why such haste? Why was the very location where the most famous woman in the world died treated with such disregard for preservation of evidence? For some, this haste suggested incompetence. For others, it looked like deliberate erasure. Then there was the driver, Henri Paul. Official reports claimed that he was intoxicated, with a blood alcohol level far above the legal limit. The narrative quickly painted him as the reckless cause of Diana's death. But questions piled up. Witnesses who had seen him earlier in the evening swore he did not appear drunk. Surveillance footage from the Ritz Hotel showed him walking steadily, not staggering as someone with such a high alcohol level would. Later, it was revealed that multiple samples of his blood had been tested, with conflicting results. Some samples even appeared to show different blood types. To skeptics, this was not mere sloppiness. It was manipulation, an attempt to frame the driver as solely responsible while deflecting attention from other possibilities. The middle of the cover-up story is filled with eyewitness accounts that were ignored or dismissed. Several people reported seeing flashes of light in the tunnel just before the crash, as if cameras or other devices had been triggered. Others described a mysterious white Fiat Uno that may have clipped the Mercedes before it struck the pillar. That car was never found, though traces of paint matching its description were discovered on the wreckage. Who owned that car? Why did it vanish from the narrative so quickly? Investigators claimed to have pursued leads, but nothing concrete was ever revealed. For those who believed Diana's death was orchestrated, the missing Fiat Uno became a symbol of deliberate omission. Medical response that night added another layer of suspicion. In France, the protocol for emergency care differs from that in Britain or the United States. Instead of rushing patients immediately to the hospital, French medics stabilized them on site. Diana remained in the wreckage for an extended period as doctors worked to stabilize her, even as she was critically injured. Critics argue that had she been transported to the hospital sooner, she might have survived. Yet the choice to follow protocol, combined with delays in her removal, has fueled speculation that her survival was not prioritized. Was this simply a tragic consequence of procedure, or was there more at play? The inquiries that followed were themselves shrouded in controversy. The French investigation closed with the conclusion that it was an accident caused by a drunk driver and paparazzi harassment. Years later, the British Operation Paget report echoed those findings. But Mohammed Al-Fayed, Dodi's father, never accepted them. He insisted that his son and Diana were assassinated, victims of a conspiracy to prevent their marriage. He spoke openly of MI6 involvement, pointing to evidence he believed had been suppressed. While many dismissed him as a grieving father desperate for answers, Charles's deathbed words now cast his claims in a different light. Perhaps he was closer to the truth than the world wanted to believe. Another element of the cover-up lies in Diana's own writings. Months before her death, she penned letters to friends in which she expressed fear that there were plans to kill her in a staged car accident. These letters were treated with suspicion by officials, dismissed as the paranoia of a woman under stress. But when compared to the actual events of that night, they read less like paranoia and more like prophecy. How could Diana have predicted so precisely the manner of her death if she had not sensed real danger? Why were her warnings not taken seriously by those who claimed to protect her? The end of this chapter is not closure, but accumulation. Piece by piece, the official story crumbles under the weight of inconsistencies. The rapid cleanup of the tunnel. The questionable blood tests of Henri Paul. The missing Fiat Uno. The flashes of light. The delays in treatment. The ignored letters. Each alone could be dismissed as error or coincidence, but together, they paint a picture that aligns with Charles's whispered confession. It was not just an accident. Something larger, something orchestrated, lies beneath the surface. And so, the Paris cover-up is not merely about what happened on August 31st, 1997. It is about the machinery that moved in the hours and days that followed. It is about narratives shaped and controlled, evidence lost or dismissed, and a world convinced to accept a version of events that left too many questions unanswered. When Charles broke his silence after 44 years, he cracked open the possibility that the truth had been buried all along, and that Paris was less a tragedy of fate than a carefully concealed act of power. Diana's fears were not born in the last days of her life. They had been growing for years, whispered in conversations with friends, scribbled in letters, even hinted at in interviews where her words carried the weight of someone who knew she was being watched. She was a woman who lived in the spotlight but felt danger lurking in the shadows. To many, she seemed fragile, vulnerable, and emotional, but her fears were not without foundation. When King Charles admitted that what happened in Paris was not just an accident, he confirmed what Diana herself had long suspected, that forces around her had marked her as a target. To understand her tragedy, one must enter the world of her anxieties, the warnings she left behind, and the chilling accuracy with which they came true. In the mid-1990s, Diana confided to close friends and staff that she feared for her safety. She spoke often of the possibility that her car might be tampered with. In one letter written to her butler, Paul Burrell, she explicitly stated that there was a plan to kill her in a staged car crash. The note, later revealed publicly, described her belief that someone wanted her out of the way so that Charles could remarry without obstruction. At the time, many dismissed this as paranoia, the product of stress, depression, and her fracturing relationship with the monarchy. Yet in hindsight, it reads more like a cry for help, one that was ignored until it was too late. Diana also felt increasingly isolated in her final years. After her divorce in 1996, she was stripped of the title Her Royal Highness. Though still Princess of Wales, she no longer had the same formal protection as when she was married to Charles. Her security detail was reduced, her presence within palace life diminished. While she found freedom in that separation, it also left her vulnerable. She believed that the surveillance around her intensified rather than decreased. Friends recalled her checking rooms for listening devices, worrying that her phone calls were being monitored, even altering travel plans at the last moment to throw off those she suspected were watching. Her fears were not just about the institution she had left. She also believed her global activism had made her enemies. By the late 1990s, Diana had thrown herself into campaigns against landmines, visiting war zones, hugging victims, and drawing worldwide attention to the human cost of weapons manufacturers. Her work embarrassed governments and angered industries with enormous influence. British officials privately criticized her campaign, with one defense minister dismissing her as a loose cannon. But to the public, her compassion only strengthened her image. To those whose interests were threatened, however, she was becoming dangerously effective. Diana herself seemed aware of this. She told confidants that her work placed her in opposition to powerful figures, and she feared they would find a way to silence her. The middle of Diana's story of fear lies in how she tried to balance her vulnerability with her determination to live freely. She traveled widely, courted the press when it suited her, and built her humanitarian brand with increasing independence. Yet, even in her moments of triumph, she felt the weight of threat. A friend recalled her once saying, "If something happens to me, it won't be by accident." These words, chilling at the time, became prophetic after Paris. To hear them now, in the light of Charles's deathbed confession, is to realize that Diana may have known more than anyone admitted. Her relationship with Dodi Fayed amplified her sense of danger. The prospect of a future with him, one that might include marriage, made her both happy and anxious. She worried about the implications of such a union, not for herself, but for her children. What would it mean for William and Harry if she married a man despised by the establishment? Would the monarchy retaliate in ways that reached beyond disapproval? These questions were not abstract. They weighed on her as real fears, and those close to her later testified that she often voiced concerns that her life would be cut short before she could begin this new chapter. The press coverage of Diana also fed her anxiety. She had long been hounded by paparazzi, chased relentlessly, photographed without pause. But she felt the intensity had shifted in the months leading up to her death. The pursuit was more aggressive, the scrutiny harsher. She believed she was being deliberately pushed, her image manipulated to make her seem unstable or erratic. And she feared that the campaign against her would not stop at character assassination. The idea that her enemies might arrange something far worse was never far from her mind. The end of this chapter rests on the realization that Diana's fears were not unfounded paranoia, but foresight. Her letters, her confessions to friends, her constant vigilance, they were all signs of a woman who sensed danger closing in. When Charles finally admitted that her death was not just an accident, it was the ultimate validation of everything Diana had warned about. She had felt the walls closing in. She had tried to speak, but no one in power listened. Her fears became her fate. And so, Diana's story is not only about tragedy, but about prophecy ignored. She foresaw the possibility of a staged accident. She spoke of it. She left written evidence of it. And still, the world was convinced to see her death as mere chance. Only now, with Charles's dying words, does her fear resurface as undeniable. What she sensed all along may have been the truth, that she was never meant to walk freely into the life she was building, that the crown she once wore carried a shadow long enough to extinguish her light. The story of Diana's final chapter cannot be told without fully understanding the presence of Dodi Fayed in her life. To the public, he was a wealthy playboy, the son of Mohammed Al Fayed, and the man who appeared at Diana's side during the summer of 1997. To Diana, he was something far more complex, a man who represented possibility, freedom, and a future that broke away from the shackles of the monarchy. Yet to the establishment, his relationship with her was viewed as dangerous, even intolerable. When Charles confessed on his deathbed that what happened in Paris was not simply an accident, his words drew new attention to the role Dodi played in the narrative of Diana's demise. Their love story was brief, but it was loaded with implications that went far beyond personal happiness. Dodi's background made him a controversial partner in the eyes of the British elite. His father, Mohammed Al Fayed, was an outspoken billionaire who had long clashed with the establishment. Despite owning Harrods, one of the most iconic institutions in Britain, Mohammed was denied British citizenship multiple times. He accused the government of discrimination, spoke bitterly of the royal family, and carried grievances that made him an outsider to the establishment he wished to join. For Diana, who herself had felt the sting of exclusion and alienation within palace life, this outsider status may have made the Fayed family more relatable. But for those who valued tradition, the prospect of Diana aligning herself permanently with the Fayeds was a nightmare. Dodi himself was not just his father's son. He had a history of relationships with models and actresses, a reputation for extravagance, and the kind of lifestyle that tabloids devoured. Yet in the summer of 1997, he became something different. He became the man who made Diana smile again. The photographs of them together, sunlit on a yacht in the Mediterranean, were more than celebrity snapshots. They were symbols of a woman breaking free from the shadow of the crown and finding joy in her own terms. Those images made front-page headlines across the world. But to the monarchy, those same images sent shockwaves of unease. The middle of this chapter lies in the deeper consequences of what Dodi represented. If Diana married him, her children, William and Harry, would grow up with a Muslim stepfather. To many in Britain, this would not have been controversial. To others, particularly within the deeply traditional and often insular circles of the establishment, it was unthinkable. The monarchy, which thrived on continuity, heritage, and carefully curated image, would have been forever tied to a man and a family it did not trust. This was not only about personal prejudice. It was about the perceived stability of the institution itself. The union of Diana and Dodi would have rewritten the royal family's story in ways that those in power could not control. The rumors of engagement only deepened the anxiety. Reports later revealed that Dodi had purchased a ring for Diana from a Paris jeweler shortly before the crash. Though some debate whether he had already proposed, Mohammed Al-Fayed remained insistent that his son and Diana were about to announce their engagement. If this were true, then Diana was on the cusp of another transformation, from a divorced princess to a bride once more, a bride whose new husband would place her even further outside the reach of the monarchy's control. For her supporters, it would have been a beautiful second chance at love. For those invested in preserving royal tradition, it was a threat that could not be tolerated. There is also the matter of perception. Diana's popularity had never waned, even after her divorce. If anything, her separation from the monarchy only increased her standing with the public. She was seen as authentic, compassionate, and relatable in ways that few royals had ever been. Her romance with Dodi, then, was not just about two people. It was about the merging of symbols, the people's princess with a man who embodied wealth, independence, and the outsider's fight against the establishment. Together, they represented change. And change, in the world of monarchy, can be lethal. The end of this chapter comes with the realization that Dodi was more than a companion. He was a catalyst. His presence in Diana's life magnified everything she stood for and everything the monarchy feared. He was the man who offered her freedom, but also the man whose connection to her threatened to upend centuries of carefully guarded tradition. When Charles whispered that Diana's death was not just an accident, it is impossible to ignore the role Dodi played in shaping the stakes of that night. Their love may have been short-lived, but it carried consequences that reverberated across nations. In the end, the Dodi factor is not merely about romance. It is about the collision of love and power, freedom and control, tradition and rebellion. Diana and Dodi together represented a possibility too radical for those who believed the monarchy must remain unchallenged. And in the shadows of Paris, that possibility came to a violent end. From the moment Diana first stepped into the public eye, she became a magnet for the media. The young schoolteacher who transformed into a princess was an irresistible story for newspapers, television, and tabloids around the world. Her beauty, her vulnerability, and her ability to connect with ordinary people made her more than just a royal figure. She became the most photographed woman in the world. By the time her life ended in Paris, she had endured decades of being hunted, scrutinized, and dissected. To many, the media was both the lens that made her a global icon and the hammer that broke her spirit. When Charles whispered on his deathbed that her death was not just an accident, the role of the media in her demise could not be ignored. They were the visible chasers that night, but were they also convenient scapegoats in a much larger storm? The obsession with Diana had reached a fever pitch by the mid-1990s. Every gesture, every dress, every outing became headline news. Photographers earned fortunes from images of her, and editors knew that her face sold newspapers like no other. It was a cycle that fed itself. The public demanded more of Diana, and the media delivered, no matter the cost. Paparazzi trailed her cars, camped outside her homes, and used long lenses to peer into her private moments. Diana, while adept at using the press when it suited her causes, also felt suffocated by it. She once said that the media attention made her feel as though she were being hunted. On the night of August 31st, 1997, that hunting instinct was on full display. Paparazzi followed Diana and Dodi from the Ritz Hotel, chasing the Mercedes through the Paris streets on motorcycles. When the crash occurred, they were among the first on the scene. Some reports claimed they took photographs of the wreckage before offering help. Those images, never publicly released in full, became infamous in their absence, reminders of the invasive presence that haunted Diana until her last breath. It was easy for authorities to blame the photographers. They were reckless, aggressive, and undeniably part of the chase. But could they alone have caused the crash? Or were they simply the surface story that concealed deeper forces? The middle of this chapter lies in the contradictions between how Diana saw the media and how they portrayed her. She had learned to manipulate their hunger. She called photographers herself at times, ensuring coverage of her charity work. She posed with AIDS patients at a time when the disease carried enormous stigma, knowing the photographs would challenge perceptions. She walked through landmine fields with the cameras rolling, turning humanitarian action into global awareness. In these moments, she wielded the press like a weapon. Yet this same tool also became her tormentor. When her marriage crumbled, the media painted her as unstable, emotional, and manipulative. When she sought love with Dodi, they framed her as reckless and irresponsible. She was both their star and their target, praised and punished in equal measure. After her death, the media's role became the subject of intense debate. Were they the villains who chased her to her end, or were they the convenient distraction from more sinister realities? Investigations leaned heavily on their involvement, citing their pursuit as a factor in the crash. Several photographers were even arrested, though charges were later dropped. Yet questions persisted. Had the media been deliberately placed at the center of the story to deflect suspicion from other forces? Charles's confession suggests that while the paparazzi were undeniably present, they may not have been the only ones responsible. The storm that followed Diana's death revealed the power of media narratives. For days, television screens were filled with images of grieving crowds, mountains of flowers outside Kensington Palace, and endless footage of her life. The same media that had hounded her now sanctified her, turning her into a martyr in death. But beneath the surface of this mourning spectacle lay an unspoken bargain. By focusing on the paparazzi, the media avoided asking harder questions about the establishment. Who benefited from Diana's absence? Who had the most to lose if she had lived to remarry, to speak more freely, to continue her humanitarian crusades? These were questions that faded under the noise of blaming the photographers. The end of this chapter rests on the irony of Diana's relationship with the press. She was both made and destroyed by them. They elevated her beyond royalty, making her a global icon whose name carried more weight than the crown itself. Yet they also contributed to the fear, the anxiety, and the chaos that defined her final years. In death, they became both the easy culprits and the shield behind which more powerful interests could hide. Charles's final words give new weight to the idea that the media storm was not the whole story, but the cover under which a darker truth operated. The media did not just follow Diana, they consumed her. And in Paris, they became the visible face of a tragedy that may have had invisible architects. The storm that surrounded her life did not end in that tunnel. It was only transformed into the mythology of her death.